The Mafia boss saw the black maid's sacrifice. His view on her changed. Maria Johnson never thought her life would take such a dramatic turn. As a maid working in the lavish mansion of Mafia boss Dominic Moretti, she had always kept a low profile, quietly going about her duties without attracting attention. She had learned early on that staying invisible was the safest way to survive in a world where power and wealth controlled everything. But today, things were different. The baby she had been tasked with caring for had been crying uncontrollably for hours. No matter what she did, he just wouldn't stop. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she couldn't just stand by and let the child suffer. Maria's own heart ached for the little one, and with a quiet determination, she decided to break the rules. She gently lifted the baby in her arms, cradling him close to her chest. She knew the risks. If anyone found out, she could lose her job or worse, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The baby needed comfort, and Maria's instincts told her to act. As she began to nurse the child, the soothing rhythm calmed him, and soon, his cries faded into peaceful silence. It was a simple, yet powerful act of compassion, one that Maria didn't think twice about. But little did she know, her decision would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Dominic Moretti, the Mafia boss who ran the household, had been unaware of the turmoil his son was experiencing. He had always been a man of control, never showing weakness, but today, something had shifted. As he entered the nursery, his eyes immediately locked onto Maria, who was holding his son with such tenderness. For a brief moment, he stood there in silence, watching. He had always seen his employees as tools, people who existed to serve his needs, but as he observed Maria's sacrifice, something inside him began to stir. Maria didn't notice Dominic's presence at first, too focused on the child in her arms. But when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, she froze. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. Dominic's usual cold, calculating demeanor softened, just slightly. He took a step forward, his eyes lingering on the scene before him. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, but not as harsh as usual. Maria's heart skipped a beat, but she held his gaze, her voice barely a whisper as she explained. "He was in pain. I just couldn't let him suffer." Dominic didn't respond immediately. He studied her, as though seeing her for the first time. The silence between them stretched, but for once, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if both of them were silently processing what had just transpired. After what felt like an eternity, Dominic nodded slowly. "You can stay," he said, his voice still calm, but there was a new note of respect in it. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. She had expected him to reprimand her, maybe even fire her. But instead, he had shown understanding, something she hadn't expected from someone like him. Dominic turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving Maria standing there, still holding the baby. Her heart was racing, but in that moment, something inside her shifted as well. She had just done something that felt right, something she had never expected would earn her the respect of the man who controlled everything in that house. Maria didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Maria stood there for a few moments, still holding Dominic's son in her arms, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. She had expected him to scold her, to fire her, or perhaps even something worse. But instead, he had shown a side of himself that Maria had never seen before. For the first time, he had treated her not as a mere servant, but as someone who mattered. She carefully laid the baby back down in his crib, watching him settle into a peaceful slumber. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway once again, his tall figure casting a shadow in the dimly lit room. This time, there was no anger in his eyes, no coldness. Instead, his gaze was softer, almost thoughtful. "I didn't expect that," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight Maria wasn't accustomed to hearing from him. Maria stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The words that had once come so easily to her seemed to have abandoned her. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her head down, doing her work without complaint. But now, in the presence of this man, she felt exposed, vulnerable. I couldn't stand to see him suffer," Maria finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I broke the rules, but I couldn't let him cry like that." Dominic nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, both of them standing in the quiet nursery, the only sound the soft breathing of the baby in the crib. Maria felt as though she were waiting for something, an answer, a reaction, some kind of acknowledgement. Finally, Dominic spoke again, his voice low but steady. "I've never seen that side of you before," he said, his words carrying an edge of curiosity. Maria didn't know how to respond to that. She had never really seen that side of herself before, either. All she had known was the overwhelming need to help the child, to make him feel better. It was an instinct, a motherly instinct, even though she had no children of her own. She had lost her daughter years ago, and the pain of that loss still lingered in her heart. "You've been here for a long time," Dominic continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've always seen you as just another employee, but now I see something else. Something I wasn't expecting." Maria didn't know what he meant by that. Was he referring to her compassion? Or was he talking about something deeper? She wasn't sure, but she could feel the tension between them, like an unspoken understanding beginning to form. I didn't mean to overstep," she said quickly, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I just wanted to help." Dominic shook his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You didn't overstep," he said, his voice softening. "You did what you felt was right. And for that, I respect you." The words hit Maria like a wave. Respect. She had never expected to hear that word from someone like him, someone so powerful, so used to being in control. It was a small thing, a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like more than she could have ever imagined. "Thank you," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't know how to express what she was feeling, but somehow, those two words felt like enough. Dominic nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've seen a lot of things in my life," he said quietly, "but this is different. You're different." Maria didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure if he was referring to her actions or her as a person. All she knew was that something had changed between them, something subtle but undeniable. For the first time, she wasn't just the help. She wasn't just the maid or the nanny. She was Maria Johnson, a woman who had shown compassion when it was needed most, and in doing so, had earned the respect of the most feared man in the city. As Dominic turned to leave the room, he paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder. "Stay with him," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You've earned that much." Maria watched him leave, her heart still racing in her chest. She had no idea what this new dynamic between them meant, but she knew one thing for sure: everything had changed. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt as though she had a place in this world, a place where she was seen and respected for who she truly was. Maria spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection. Everything had changed. Her interactions with Dominic Moretti, the Mafia boss she had worked for all this time, felt different now. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, though his gaze seemed warmer, more understanding. It was the way he spoke to her, the respect in his voice, and the subtle shift in the way he treated her compared to before. She had always been just another employee, another face in the house staff, but now, for some reason, she was something more. At first, Maria tried to push those thoughts away. She had always kept a distance from the personal lives of the family she worked for. That was the rule. Never get too close, never expect anything. She was just here to do her job, to take care of the household, to stay invisible. But now, staying invisible felt impossible. Dominic had seen her. He had seen her for who she was, not just as an employee but as a person. It was a feeling Maria wasn't sure how to process. She was so used to being overlooked, so accustomed to people seeing only what they needed from her work, her quiet service. But Dominic had seen her heart, the way she had instinctively cared for his son. That was something new. As the days passed, Dominic continued to treat her with a newfound respect. He didn't speak much about their conversation in the nursery, but the small gestures were enough. He began to speak to her directly, not as an inferior, but as someone whose opinions mattered. He would ask her how the children were doing, how she was adjusting to life in the mansion. He even started to include her in small conversations about the household's needs, something he had never done before. Maria couldn't help but notice these changes. It was as if Dominic was trying to make her feel like she belonged in a world she had never truly been a part of. But it wasn't just his treatment of her that was different. It was the way the others in the household began to behave. The other staff, who had once ignored her or looked at her with condescension, started to treat her with a subtle respect. The cook, who had often spoken to her like she was invisible, now greeted her with a nod and a smile. The housekeeper, once dismissive, now shared small bits of advice with her, as if acknowledging her presence in a way she had never experienced. The change was slow but undeniable. It wasn't just about the way people treated her. It was about how she began to see herself. Maria had always felt like she was just a maid, just a servant. Her worth was measured by how well she did her job. But now, as she walked through the halls of the mansion, she couldn't help but feel that there was more to her than just the work she did. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, she found herself standing in the hallway, looking out at the sprawling grounds of the mansion. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the garden, and for the first time in a long while, Maria felt a sense of peace. She wasn't sure what it was, but she felt a connection to this place, to the family she served, in a way she had never felt before. It wasn't just the comfort of the job or the fact that she had a roof over her head. It was the respect. It was the recognition that she was more than just someone who cleaned and cared for the house. She was someone who mattered. But even as Maria allowed herself to feel this way, a part of her still hesitated. She had learned long ago that hope could be dangerous. Hope could lead to disappointment. She couldn't let herself get too comfortable. She couldn't let herself believe that things would stay this way forever. The world she lived in, the world of wealth and power, was fragile. People like her didn't belong here. As she turned to head back to her quarters, she was startled by a voice calling her name. She looked up to find Dominic standing at the end of the hallway, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the dim light. "Maria," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Could you come here for a moment?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure why, but there was something about the way he said her name that made her feel as if she were being summoned for something important. She nodded and walked toward him, trying to keep her nerves in check. As she approached, Dominic's expression softened. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did," he said, his gaze steady but warm. "You saved my son. You don't know what that means to me." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had done what any person with a heart would have done, but hearing Dominic say those words, hearing him thank her, was more than she could have ever imagined. "It was nothing," Maria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just doing what needed to be done." Dominic shook his head. "No, Maria. It wasn't nothing. What you did was more than that. It was something I will never forget." Maria felt her heart swell at his words. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen, for the person she was. Not just for the work she did, but for the heart she had shown when it mattered most. "Thank you," Dominic said again, his voice sincere. "You've earned more than just my respect. You've earned my trust." Those words hit Maria harder than she could have imagined. Trust. It was something she had never expected to hear from someone like Dominic. In this world of power and control, trust was a rare commodity. But now, as she stood before him, she realized that something had shifted, not just between them, but inside of her. She was no longer just the maid. She was someone who mattered. Maria couldn't quite believe the turn her life had taken. Every day since that moment in the nursery, things had felt different, subtle changes, but changes nonetheless. Dominic had been kind to her, yes, but there was something more now. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet recognition that had never existed before. She had always kept her distance from him and the other members of the household, but now, she was no longer just the maid. She was something else, something more than just the person who cleaned, who took care of the children. She was part of the household, in a way she had never felt before. Maria was careful not to get too used to it. She had learned long ago not to let herself get too comfortable. The world of the wealthy, of power and control, was a fragile thing. People like her didn't belong here for long, and she knew it. But even as she told herself this, even as she reminded herself of the rules she had always followed, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was more than just an invisible worker. She felt like she mattered. It was during one of these quiet moments of reflection that Dominic called for her. Maria had been cleaning the dining room when she heard his voice in the hallway. "Maria," he said, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his usual serious expression softened by something she couldn't quite place. "Could you come with me for a moment?" She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron as she followed him down the hall. Her heart fluttered nervously. Every time Dominic spoke to her now, it felt like an unspoken invitation to something bigger, something that made her uncomfortable yet hopeful at the same time. When they reached his office, he motioned for her to sit. Maria hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him at the desk. She couldn't quite read his expression, but there was a warmth there, a sincerity she hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking about what you did," Dominic began, his voice steady but carrying a weight of something more. "What you did for my son. It changed everything. I've been a fool, not seeing people for who they really are." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but his words made something inside her stir. It was just instinct," she said quietly. "He needed comfort, and I gave it to him. That's all." Dominic leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on her with a focus that made her pulse quicken. "No, Maria," he said softly. "It wasn't just instinct. It was something more. You did what no one else would have done. You showed compassion when no one else did." Maria swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. She had always been the one to put others' needs before her own, the one who quietly took care of everyone else. But hearing Dominic speak about her in such a way made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She had never thought much of herself beyond her role as a servant. But now, Dominic was making her question everything. "I see you differently now," Dominic continued, his voice low. "You've earned my trust. I want you to stay here, in this house, as part of this family. I know it might sound strange, but you've proven yourself more than just a maid." Maria's mind raced, trying to process his words. Stay here? As part of the family? She had never even imagined such a thing. She had always been a servant, a worker, someone who was never meant to be a part of the world the family lived in. But Dominic's words, his offer, made her think. Maybe she did belong here, in some small way. Maybe she had always belonged, but she had never let herself see it. "Thank you," Maria finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know if I can." She trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Dominic placed a hand on the desk, his eyes softening as he regarded her. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "But I want you to know that you're not invisible anymore, Maria. You've proven your worth, and that's more than most people ever do in this world." Maria felt something stir inside her, a mix of hope, disbelief, and gratitude. It was too much to process all at once, but for the first time, she felt like she was seeing a path forward, a path where she wasn't just the maid or the help. She was someone who mattered. As she left his office, her thoughts were swirling. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that something had shifted inside her. She had always tried to be invisible, always tried to remain just a shadow in the background, but now, she could see a way forward. A way where she wasn't just serving others, but where she could be seen for who she truly was. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Maria felt like she had a place in it. A place where she belonged. Maria's life had taken a turn that she never could have predicted. Each day, the distance between her old life and this new reality grew wider, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging she had never felt before. She had always kept her distance, always stayed in the background, but now, with Dominic's respect, everything was different. She was no longer just the help. She was someone who mattered. It wasn't just about the way he had acknowledged her actions or the subtle shift in the way he treated her. It was the way he looked at her now. The cold, distant gaze he had once reserved for his employees had softened. There was something more in his eyes, something that made her heart race every time their paths crossed. The awkwardness between them was still there, but it was different now. There was a mutual understanding, an unspoken connection that neither of them could deny. Maria had always feared getting too close to anyone, but with Dominic, it felt like the right thing to do. She found herself looking for reasons to stay close to him, to be near him, even though she knew she shouldn't. But her feelings were becoming harder to ignore. She had always admired him from a distance, but now, something inside her was shifting. The more she saw him, the more she found herself drawn to him. Dominic was a man who had built an empire, a man who had control over everything and everyone. He was feared, respected, and admired by those around him. But Maria had always seen beyond that. She had seen the kindness in him, the vulnerability that he rarely showed to anyone. As much as she tried to push these feelings away, they kept growing. It was a feeling she couldn't quite put into words, but it was undeniable. She wasn't the only one who had noticed the change. The other staff members had begun to treat her differently, too. It was subtle at first, small gestures like a nod of acknowledgement or a friendly smile. But over time, it grew. They no longer looked at her with disdain or indifference. They treated her like an equal, like someone who deserved respect. Maria couldn't help but wonder if this change was a result of Dominic's newfound respect for her. The more he included her in conversations, the more she realized how much she had underestimated him. She had always seen him as a man of power, a man who ruled with an iron fist, but now, she was beginning to see a different side of him. He was not just a mafia boss. He was a man who had feelings, who cared about those around him, even if he didn't show it often. One evening, as Maria was finishing her shift, she found herself walking through the hallway toward the kitchen. She had just finished serving dinner and was ready to retreat to her quarters for some much-needed rest. As she passed by Dominic's office, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should knock or just keep walking. But before she could make a decision, Dominic's voice called out to her. "Maria, could you come in for a moment?" His voice was warm, and Maria felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her chest. She had learned not to question him, but tonight, something in his tone made her want to say yes. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dominic was standing by his desk, looking over some papers, but when he saw her, he smiled. It wasn't the usual guarded smile he gave to people, but a genuine smile. It made Maria's heart skip a beat. "I need your opinion on something," he said, his voice casual, but with an undertone of sincerity. Maria nodded, unsure of what to expect. She had never been asked for her opinion before, let alone by someone like him. "Of course, sir," she said, stepping closer. Dominic motioned for her to sit. "I've been thinking about the household schedule. It's been a bit chaotic lately, and I want to make some changes. I'd appreciate your thoughts on it." Maria was taken aback. She had always followed the schedule without question, but now, Dominic was asking for her input. It was a small thing, but it meant more than she could express. As they discussed the changes, Maria couldn't help but notice how easy it was to talk to him. He listened to her suggestions, offered his own thoughts, and together, they worked out a plan that made the house run more smoothly. By the time the conversation ended, Maria felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about the work. It was about being seen, being valued for who she was and what she could offer. As she stood to leave, Dominic looked at her with a rare softness in his eyes. "Thank you, Maria," he said. "I appreciate your help." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with emotions she wasn't ready to confront. She had never imagined that a simple conversation could mean so much. But as she walked back to her quarters that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was someone who had earned his trust, his respect, and maybe even more. Maria had begun to settle into a new routine in the mansion. Each day, the house seemed a little more familiar, and the weight of the past, the days when she had been nothing more than an invisible worker, seemed to slowly fade. The respect that Dominic had shown her had changed everything. She found herself more confident, more willing to speak up when necessary, and more comfortable in the presence of those around her. It was a small shift, but it was enough. Still, despite the growing sense of belonging, Maria knew better than to let her guard down completely. She had learned long ago that life could change in an instant, and nothing was guaranteed. But as the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. She found herself thinking about Dominic more and more. Not just as the mafia boss, not just as the man who controlled everything, but as a person. A man who had shown her kindness when it mattered most. A man who had trusted her in a way she had never expected. Their interactions had become more frequent, and although they spoke mostly about household matters, there was an underlying tension that neither of them addressed. Maria could feel it every time their eyes met, every time their conversations lingered just a moment too long. She wasn't the only one who had noticed the change. The other staff members had started treating her differently. It was subtle at first, a nod here, a smile there. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. They no longer whispered behind her back or avoided eye contact. They treated her like someone who was important, someone who belonged. It was as if, by earning Dominic's respect, she had earned theirs as well. One evening, as the mansion settled into the calm of the night, Maria found herself standing in the garden, staring up at the stars. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence around her. She had always found solace in moments like this, when the world felt far away and she could just breathe. But tonight, her thoughts kept returning to Dominic. She couldn't explain it. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, but it was more than just gratitude. There was a connection, a pull between them that was undeniable. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find Dominic walking toward her, his dark figure outlined by the soft light of the mansion behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, looking at each other in the quiet of the night. "Maria," Dominic said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "I've been meaning to talk to you." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect, but something in his tone made her feel nervous. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "For everything you've done. Not just for my son, but for the house, for everyone. You've done more than anyone could ask." Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had never expected this from him, and hearing it made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: appreciated. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, her voice soft. Dominic shook his head. "No, Maria. It's more than that. You've become a part of this family, whether you realize it or not." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Maria didn't know how to respond. She had never considered herself a part of anything, let alone a family. She was just the maid, the servant. But here was Dominic, telling her that she mattered. It was more than she could have hoped for, more than she had ever expected. She opened her mouth to say something, but Dominic stopped her. "Maria," he said softly, "I know you've been through a lot. I know you've been holding back, trying to protect yourself. But you don't have to do that anymore. I want you to know that you're safe here. You're not just the help. You're part of this." Maria's heart raced. The words felt like a lifeline, like something she had been waiting for without even realizing it. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't just want something from her. She wasn't invisible. She mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic smiled, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of warmth in his eyes that wasn't just the result of politeness or duty. It was real. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice low. "I meant every word." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them comfortable now, as if they both understood something unspoken. It wasn't the grand gesture that changed everything. It was the quiet acknowledgement, the recognition that they were both more than just their roles, more than just the masks they wore. And in that moment, Maria realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't have to hide anymore. She could be herself. And maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her in this world, beside the people who had once seemed so distant, so untouchable. Maria stood by the window, looking out at the sprawling gardens as the sun set behind the mansion. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the cool breeze of the evening seemed to carry a sense of peace with it. Yet, despite the calmness of the moment, Maria felt a stir in her heart. It had been several weeks since the night in the garden when Dominic had spoken to her, when he had acknowledged her as more than just an employee. Since then, their interactions had become more frequent, more natural. She had become a part of the household in ways she never imagined, but with it came a growing awareness of the emotions she was beginning to feel. Dominic Moretti, the man who had once been distant and cold to her, now treated her with a kindness that was hard to ignore. Their conversations had shifted from simple household matters to deeper, more personal topics. They spoke about their pasts, their losses, and their hopes for the future. It was in these moments that Maria found herself seeing him in a new light, not just as the Mafia boss, but as a man who had experienced pain, who understood the fragility of life in ways most people would never know. But as much as she wanted to embrace this new reality, Maria still struggled with the fear that it wouldn't last. She had always been careful to keep her emotions in check, to never let herself get too close to anyone. It was a defense mechanism, a way to protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak that came with caring too much. But with Dominic, it was different. The pull between them was undeniable. She found herself thinking about him when she shouldn't, wondering what it would be like if they could be more than just employer and employee. She had never allowed herself to entertain such thoughts before, but now, they felt like a reality she couldn't ignore. One evening, as she finished her work in the kitchen, she was startled by the sound of Dominic's voice calling her name. "Maria, could you come here for a moment?" His tone was casual, but there was something in it that made her heart skip a beat. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward his office, her steps slow, but steady. As she entered, she found him standing by the window, his back to her. He turned as she entered, his eyes meeting hers with that familiar warmth she had come to expect. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice calm but serious. Maria felt a flutter of nervousness. What could he possibly want to discuss now? "Of course," she replied, her voice soft. Dominic motioned for her to sit, and she did, feeling the weight of the conversation settle between them. "Maria," he began, his voice steady. "I know this may sound strange, but I've been thinking about the way things have changed between us. I want you to know that I value the trust we've built, and I respect you more than you know." Maria's heart raced at his words. She wasn't sure what to say. She had always been the one to keep her feelings hidden, but hearing him speak so openly made her feel vulnerable in a way she wasn't prepared for. She started, but Dominic raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "I just want you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever happens, I'll be here." The simplicity of his words struck Maria deeply. In all her years of working for him, she had never expected to hear such kindness from him, especially not from someone as powerful and feared as Dominic Moretti. She had always seen him as untouchable, a man who controlled everything and everyone around him. But now, in this moment, he seemed different, vulnerable even. "Thank you," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic smiled softly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met with an understanding that neither of them had ever shared before. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, but neither of them seemed eager to break the silence. Maria wasn't sure what this all meant, what these moments between them would lead to, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the verge of something real, something more than just a passing interaction. As she left his office that night, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted once again. She wasn't just the maid, the invisible worker in the background. She was someone who mattered to Dominic, someone who had earned his respect and trust. It was a feeling that both terrified and exhilarated her, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, she would never be the same. Maria stood in the quiet of the hallway, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. The mansion, with its grandeur and silent opulence, seemed different now. It wasn't just the beauty of the place, or the soft whispers of the staff she used to ignore. It was the way it felt like home, her home, in a way she had never allowed herself to believe before. Dominic had changed everything. His respect, his words of trust, and the subtle, unspoken bond between them had made her question everything she had once known about herself. She wasn't just the help anymore. She wasn't invisible. She mattered. But as much as she wanted to embrace this newfound sense of belonging, a part of Maria still hesitated. She had been alone for so long, had learned to shield her heart from others. She couldn't allow herself to get too comfortable, too hopeful. After all, in this world of power and control, things could change in an instant. But even as these doubts swirled in her mind, there was a small, quiet voice telling her to trust in what she was feeling. Maybe for once, she could. As Maria made her way back to the staff quarters, she passed by the kitchen, where she heard familiar voices, staff members laughing softly, talking about the day. It was strange how easy it had become to be a part of those conversations. Not long ago, she had been the one standing quietly in the background, invisible to everyone. But now, she was included, her opinions and ideas valued. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough to make her realize how far she had come. She had earned a place here, not just as a worker, but as someone who had proven herself worthy of respect. That night, as she lay in bed, the soft rustle of the sheets and the distant hum of the mansion's quiet surroundings, Maria found herself thinking about Dominic again. It was impossible not to. The way he looked at her now, the way he treated her with such kindness and consideration. She had always admired him from afar, seeing him as a man of power, someone who ruled over everything with an iron grip. But now, after everything that had happened, she saw him differently. She saw the man behind the facade, the man who cared deeply for those around him, who was capable of kindness and tenderness. She didn't know what to make of it, or of the feelings it stirred in her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let herself feel anything for him, or if she was simply afraid of what those feelings might mean. But as the days passed, Maria couldn't help but notice how often their paths seemed to cross. He would stop by her station in the kitchen, ask her opinion on small matters around the house, and sometimes just talk. It was never anything monumental, just small, casual conversations, but each time, it felt like the distance between them was getting smaller. It wasn't just the moments they shared, it was the way he made her feel. There was no pretense, no expectation. He treated her like a person, like someone who mattered. One evening, as Maria was finishing up her shift, she found herself standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the garden. The sky was dark, the stars just beginning to appear, and the air was cool with the promise of autumn. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, the quiet of the night settling her thoughts. She was lost in the beauty of the moment when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Maria," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Maria felt a flutter in her chest as she nodded, unsure of what to expect. He walked over to her, his steps measured, and stood beside her by the window. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, almost familiar, like two people who had finally found a way to exist in each other's presence without the weight of the past between them. "I've been thinking," Dominic said, breaking the silence. "About everything. About how much you've done for this house, for my family." Maria felt a knot form in her stomach. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she listened quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't say it enough," he continued, "but I want you to know that your efforts don't go unnoticed. You've earned more than just respect here. You've earned my trust." Maria's breath caught in her throat. His words were simple, but they meant more than she could put into words. She had always felt like she was just another face in the background, never seen, never truly acknowledged. But now, Dominic was telling her she was more than that. She was a person who mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, Maria felt a sense of warmth spread through her. "You've done more than you know, Maria," he said quietly. "You've made a difference here." As the night stretched on, Maria stood in the quiet of the kitchen, trying to absorb everything that had just happened. She wasn't sure what the future held, or where this path would lead. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The weeks had gone by in a blur, each day more fulfilling than the last. Dominic's kindness, his words of trust, had given her a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. But as much as she tried to ignore it, the uncertainty still lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. She had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something real, something more than just being the maid, more than just someone who cleaned and cared for the house. She had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her in this world, beside Dominic. But the fear of disappointment still held tight in her chest. She had been through too much to let herself fall too deeply. Yet, the more time she spent with him, the more she realized that what they shared was something more than just mutual respect. There was an unspoken connection between them, something that neither of them had addressed, but both of them felt. It wasn't just the kindness he showed her. It was the way he made her feel like she wasn't just an employee, like she was a part of something that mattered. And it wasn't just her. The other staff members, too, had started to treat her differently. It was subtle, but she could see it. They no longer looked at her with pity or indifference. They treated her like someone who had earned their place, someone who was no longer invisible. But as much as she tried to embrace these changes, Maria still wasn't sure where it would all lead. She couldn't let herself get too comfortable. She had learned the hard way that nothing in this world was guaranteed. And still, Dominic's presence in her life had become something she couldn't deny. He had been the one constant, the one person who had seen her for who she truly was. Not just a maid, not just the help, but someone who had a heart, someone who could be trusted. One evening, after a long day, Maria found herself walking through the halls of the mansion, lost in thought. The house was quieter now, The staff had mostly retired for the night, and the mansion seemed to hum with a peaceful stillness. She made her way to the kitchen for a glass of water when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dominic walking toward her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and something in the air between them shifted. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic words spoken. It was just the way they stood there, silently acknowledging each other. "Maria," Dominic said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "Can we talk for a moment?" Maria nodded, her heart racing. She followed him into the kitchen, where the soft light illuminated the room in a warm glow. Dominic didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with an intensity that made Maria feel both nervous and strangely comforted. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but with a softness that made Maria's heart flutter. "About everything." She waited for him to continue, her breath caught in her throat. "I don't know how to say this," he said, his eyes searching hers. "But I think I owe you more than just gratitude. I've seen the way you've taken care of things, the way you've cared for the children, for everyone in this house. And I've seen you." Maria felt her chest tighten at his words. He had seen her, really seen her, in a way that no one ever had before. It wasn't just about the work. It was about who she was. "You've earned more than just my respect," Dominic continued, his voice soft but firm. "You've earned my trust, Maria, and I want you to know that I value you." Maria's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never expected to hear this from him. She had never allowed herself to believe that someone like Dominic Moretti would see her as more than just the maid. But now, as she stood in the quiet of the kitchen, she realized that he did. She had earned a place in his life, just as he had earned a place in hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maria was at a loss for words, unsure of what to say or how to respond. But Dominic's steady gaze told her everything she needed to know. "I don't know what this means yet," he said finally, breaking the silence. "But I want you to know that I care about what happens to you. And I want you here, with us." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in her life, Maria felt a sense of hope she had never allowed herself to feel before. She had always been the one who kept her distance, who guarded her heart. But Dominic's words were different. They weren't just kind words, they were a promise. A promise that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone anymore. Maria swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. Dominic smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Maria's heart swell. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "You've already done more than enough." In that moment, Maria realized that everything had changed. She was no longer just the help, no longer invisible. She was seen, she was valued, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged. The fear that had held her back for so long seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet hope for what the future could hold. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it. Maria woke up early the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains and casting a warm glow across the room. It was the first time in a long while that she had woken up with a sense of peace, not the usual weight of uncertainty on her shoulders. As she stretched and got out of bed, she realized that the fear she had once carried was slowly beginning to fade. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe, like she could move forward without constantly looking over her shoulder. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of changes, all of them subtle yet profound. Her relationship with Dominic had shifted in ways that were hard to explain. It was more than just the respect he had shown her. It was the way he had made her feel valued, like she was more than just a maid in his house. She had spent years convincing herself that she was nothing more than a worker, invisible to those around her. But Dominic had made her realize that she was worthy of more than that. As she prepared for the day ahead, Maria couldn't help but smile to herself. The fear that had once held her back was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer controlled her. For the first time, she was beginning to trust in the future. She wasn't just waiting for the next disappointment, the next setback. She was ready to embrace what was to come. She walked through the mansion, carrying out her duties as she had always done, but there was a new sense of purpose in her steps. The staff treated her with more respect than ever before, and she no longer felt like she was invisible. Every task, no matter how small, felt like it mattered now. She was no longer just part of the background. She was a part of the family, and for the first time in her life, That meant something. The day passed uneventfully, but as evening approached, Maria found herself once again drawn to the quiet of the garden. It was her favorite place to think, to be alone with her thoughts. She had always been careful not to get too close to anyone, but now, as she walked through the garden, her thoughts were filled with Dominic. She had tried to push her feelings aside, tried to convince herself that it was just admiration for someone who had shown her kindness, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She wasn't just grateful for his respect, she was drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. Maria had never allowed herself to feel anything for anyone. She had always kept her emotions buried, hidden beneath the walls she had built to protect herself. But with Dominic, the walls were slowly starting to crumble. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in her life, she was willing to walk down it. As she stood in the garden, lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic walking toward her, his figure silhouetted by the fading light of the evening. He was dressed casually, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart race. "Maria," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "Can I speak with you?" She nodded, trying to steady her breath, and followed him to a bench beneath a large tree. The garden was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the evening breeze. Dominic sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for the right words. Maria waited, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been thinking about us," Dominic said, his voice low. "About the way things have changed between us." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Was he about to say what she had been afraid to hear? She had been waiting for this moment, for the truth to come out, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "I don't know what it is," Dominic continued, his eyes finally meeting hers. "But being around you, I feel something I didn't expect." Maria's heart raced. She had tried to keep her emotions in check, but hearing him say those words made her realize how much she had allowed herself to feel. "I don't want to complicate things," Dominic said, his voice soft but firm, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this goes. I want you to know that I care about you, Maria. Not just because of what you do for the family, but because of who you are." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. For so long, she had kept her distance, kept her emotions buried, but now, with Dominic's words, she realized that maybe it was time to let herself feel. Maybe it was time to trust again. "I care about you too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt like a revelation, but they also felt like the beginning of something new. Dominic smiled softly, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that felt both tentative and genuine. "We'll take this one step at a time," he said quietly. "No pressure, no expectations. Just, let's see where it goes." Maria nodded, her heart full. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She was no longer afraid of what might happen. She was ready to take that first step, to see where this new chapter of her life would lead. Maria woke up the next morning with a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. The previous night had been a turning point, and the words Dominic had spoken to her echoed in her mind as she prepared for the day ahead. She had always kept her emotions in check, never allowing herself to fully trust or let down her guard. But now, with Dominic's words of reassurance, something inside her had shifted. She could no longer hide from what she was feeling. It wasn't just respect she had for him. It was something deeper, something more personal. She couldn't ignore it any longer. As she moved through the day, performing her usual duties around the mansion, she couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The staff was treating her with more kindness, more respect. It was as if her position in the household had somehow been elevated, not just in the eyes of Dominic, but in the eyes of everyone else too. No one whispered behind her back anymore. No one looked down on her or treated her like she was invisible. Maria had earned her place here. She had earned her respect. And it felt good, but it also felt strange. She wasn't used to being seen like this, not by people who had always viewed her as just another worker. She wasn't used to being included in conversations, invited to share her thoughts on matters of the house, and treated like her opinions mattered. But with Dominic's guidance, things had changed. He had given her a voice, a place in this world. As the evening settled in and the mansion grew quiet, Maria found herself once again walking through the garden. She had spent many nights in this peaceful solitude, but tonight felt different. The air was cooler, the stars shone brighter, and the stillness of the garden felt more like home than ever before. She was lost in thought when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dominic walking toward her, his face illuminated by the soft light of the evening. There was a sense of ease in his movement, as though he were no longer the imposing mafia boss she had once known, but simply a man who had found someone, worth being vulnerable for. "Maria," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet garden. "Do you mind if we talk?" Maria's heart raced at the sound of his voice. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a directive. It was an invitation, and it made her feel seen in a way she never had before. She nodded, her throat tightening slightly, unsure of what to expect. They walked together in silence for a moment, the night air cool against their skin. Dominic led her to a bench beneath a tree, and they sat together, the quiet of the garden wrapping around them like a blanket. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maria could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, but she didn't rush him. She had learned not to rush when it came to Dominic. He would say what needed to be said in his own time. "I've been thinking," Dominic began, his voice low but steady. "About everything. About us." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had been thinking about this moment for days, wondering when Dominic would finally address what had been silently growing between them. The tension, the unspoken bond. "You don't have to say anything," Dominic continued, glancing at her with an intensity that made Maria's heart race. "But I want you to know that whatever happens next, I want to be honest with you." His words settled around her, and Maria felt a flood of emotions rise up inside her. She had never expected him to say something like this, not from someone like him. Dominic had always been a man of few words, a man who kept his emotions tightly controlled. To hear him speak so openly, so vulnerably, made Maria's heart swell with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she hadn't been ready to admit. "I want you to know that I care about you," Dominic said, his eyes searching hers. "Not just for what you do, but for who you are. You've made a difference in this house, in my life, and I can't ignore that anymore." Maria's heart fluttered in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had known that her feelings for him had been growing, but hearing him say those words, hearing him express his own feelings, made everything feel more real than it ever had before. "I never imagined that you would feel this way," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't expect this connection." Dominic reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "I didn't either," he admitted softly. "But it's real, and I can't pretend it's not." The silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared before. It wasn't heavy with doubt or uncertainty. It was comfortable, peaceful. It was the kind of silence that two people shared when they finally understood each other, when the walls that had once separated them had crumbled away. Maria looked at Dominic, her heart full of emotions she didn't know how to put into words. She had spent so much of her life being careful, being invisible, but now, with him, she didn't want to hide anymore. She didn't want to be afraid. She wanted to take this step, whatever it was, and see where it would lead. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic smiled, a small, genuine smile that made Maria's heart flutter. "Now, we see where this takes us," he said, his voice steady and full of warmth. Together, Maria's heart swelled with hope, with a sense of possibility she had never allowed herself to feel before. She didn't know where this would go, but for the first time in her life, she was ready to take that step, ready to see where the future would lead. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Maria had never felt this way before. The weight of the last few weeks, the quiet moments she had spent with Dominic, the shared understanding between them, had left her in a state of quiet reflection. She wasn't used to this, the sense of peace, the quiet certainty that things were shifting in her life. It was as if she had been living in the shadows for so long, always stepping carefully, afraid of being seen. But now, in Dominic's presence, she felt like she was finally allowed to step into the light. She had been so careful all her life, so afraid of getting too close to anyone, too afraid of feeling something for fear of it being taken away. But Dominic had changed that. He had shown her a different side of herself, a side she hadn't allowed herself to believe in. As the days passed, Maria found herself smiling more, speaking more freely with the staff, and even with Dominic. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived at the mansion. She was someone new, someone stronger, more confident, and more certain of her place in the world. But with these changes came new challenges. As much as Maria wanted to embrace the future, there were still moments of doubt, moments where she questioned whether this newfound sense of belonging would last. It was hard to shake the fear that things could go back to how they had been before. It was easy to fall back into the role she had always played, the quiet, invisible maid, unnoticed and unimportant. But then, there were moments with Dominic that reminded her that she was more than that. She wasn't just here to clean or take care of the house. She was here because she mattered. That realization kept her going, even when the doubts crept in. One afternoon, as Maria was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the family, she heard a knock at the door. She was surprised, as it was rare for anyone to come by this time of day. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Dominic standing there, looking as calm and collected as ever, but there was something different in his expression. He looked serious, but there was also something soft in his eyes. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "Can we talk?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. She nodded and stepped aside to let him in. They walked together to the sitting room, where the quiet of the house seemed to envelop them. Dominic gestured for her to sit, and she did, her heart racing as she waited for him to speak. For a few moments, there was silence between them, and Maria couldn't help but feel the weight of the words that were coming. "Maria," Dominic began, his voice soft but clear, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about us." His gaze never wavered from hers, and Maria felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic took a deep breath, his expression serious but kind. "I mean that I care about you," he said, his words steady but full of sincerity. "More than I ever expected to. And I know this may not be what either of us planned, but I think it's something we need to acknowledge." Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. She had known there was something between them, something unspoken, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel more real. "Dominic, Maria began, but she didn't know how to finish. She had never been good with words, especially when it came to her feelings. Dominic reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. "You don't need to say anything, Maria," he said softly. "I just needed you to know how I feel. I'm not asking for anything. I want to be honest with you." Maria's heart swelled at his words. She had always been the one to hide her emotions, to keep her distance, but with Dominic, everything felt different. She had never felt so seen, so valued. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind her walls. "I care about you too," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The words felt right, even though she had never expected to say them. Dominic smiled, a small, tender smile that made Maria's heart flutter. "I'm glad," he said, his voice warm. "And whatever happens next, I want you to know that you're important to me." The room seemed to hold its breath as they sat there, their hands still resting together. Maria didn't know what the future would hold for them. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had spent so much of her life hiding, keeping herself small and invisible, but now, she was ready to embrace what was to come. With Dominic by her side, she didn't need to be afraid anymore. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and Maria felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. She was no longer just the maid. She was someone who mattered, someone who had found her place in this world. Maria stood by the window the next morning, watching the sunlight filter through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. The house felt different now, quieter, more peaceful, as if the air itself had shifted. She could still feel the weight of the previous night's conversation with Dominic lingering in the back of her mind, but now it felt less like uncertainty and more like the start of something new. She had never imagined that things would change so completely. Just a few weeks ago, she had been just another member of the staff, blending into the background, careful to remain unnoticed. But now, she was someone different, someone seen, someone important. As she moved through the house that morning, she could sense the change in how people treated her. The staff no longer looked at her with indifference or with pity, as they once had. They spoke to her with respect, included her in conversations, and even made small gestures to acknowledge her place in the family. It wasn't just the shift in their behavior. It was the way she felt about herself. She had started to believe in her own worth, something she had never done before. The confidence that had once seemed so foreign was now something she carried with her. It wasn't just about her role in the household anymore. It was about how she had earned her place here, how she had earned Dominic's trust and respect. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her relationship with him had changed in ways she had never expected. It wasn't just about the power he held or the control he exerted over everything. It was about the quiet moments they shared, the moments when he saw her for who she truly was. Not just the maid, but a person deserving of kindness, of care, of respect. As the days passed, their connection deepened, though neither of them openly acknowledged it. There was a comfortable silence between them now, a silent understanding that didn't need words. But Maria couldn't ignore the way her heart fluttered every time their paths crossed. The way he looked at her, the warmth in his eyes, the genuine care in his voice. It was all so different from the cold, distant man she had first met. One evening, after a long day of work, Maria found herself once again standing in the garden, alone with her thoughts. The night had fallen, and the stars were out, twinkling in the clear sky above her. The air was cool, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves in the trees around her. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders for a moment. For once, she didn't feel the need to guard herself, to hide behind the walls she had built up over the years. She felt free, in a way she hadn't in a long time. She was lost in the tranquility of the moment when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dominic approaching, his familiar presence making her heart skip a beat. He smiled at her, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. "Maria," he said, his voice soft but firm, "do you mind if we talk?" She nodded, her throat tight with anticipation. He gestured toward a bench nearby, and they sat together, the silence between them comfortable, easy. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Dominic said after a few moments, his voice thoughtful. "About what we've been through, about everything that's changed." Maria waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been waiting for him to say something, to finally address what had been growing between them. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of the words he was about to speak. "I want you to know that what we've shared means a lot to me," Dominic continued, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that made her breath catch. "I never expected to feel this way, but I do, and I want to be open about that. I don't want to hide what's happening between us." Maria felt her chest tighten. She had known, deep down, that there was something more, but hearing him say it aloud made everything feel so real. She had spent so long trying to keep her distance, afraid of the hurt that could come from letting herself care. But now, she realized she didn't want to hold back anymore. "I feel the same way," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but full of emotion. Dominic smiled softly, a warmth in his eyes that made Maria's heart race. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly. "I want us to be able to move forward, whatever that may look like. No pressure, just honesty." Maria nodded, feeling the tension in her chest ease slightly. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't all figured out, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the same page. They sat together in silence, the night stretching on around them. Neither of them spoke, but the quiet between them felt different now. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, as though they both understood the unspoken words between them. "I'm not sure what comes next," Maria said finally, her voice soft but steady. "But I know I want to see where this goes." Dominic turned toward her, his eyes steady, full of understanding. "Me too," he said simply. For the first time, Maria felt a sense of calm settle over her. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't hiding behind walls or running from her feelings. She was ready to embrace whatever came next, to walk into the future with Dominic by her side, knowing that whatever happened, they would face it together.